All right, chapter 4. This is our first fully official proof chapter. So we're going to do a lot of proofs. You're not going to get away from them. So if you're having trouble or whatever, you're going to have to make an appointment to come see me because you're going to have to watch the videos. You're going to have to take good notes. You get to use your notes on the test. So you want to make sure you take good notes. Okay? So here we go. Congruent figures. We know this word from the previous chapter. Congruent means they have the same size and shape. So with two congruent figures, you can take one and you can move it to where the two shapes match up, and then you can see if they're congruent or not. You can look at them and tell if they're congruent or not. So that's why we did the translations and reflections and rotations from before. That way we can see if the shapes are actually congruent or not. Congruent polygons have congruent corresponding parts. This is kind of a big deal in proofs. That's why we can prove what we prove with these. Okay? You're going to have matching vertices, and those are corresponding. And then when we name the polygons, we're always going to name them in the same order all the way around. So right now, we're going to be doing a lot of triangle proofs. So we'll name the triangles in the same order all the way around. Alright, so like example 1, they tell us that triangle TJD is congruent to triangle RCF. So these two triangles are congruent. Okay? So we're going to list the corresponding parts. So angle T is congruent to angle R. Angle J is congruent to angle C. And angle D is congruent to angle F. Those would be all the angles that match up. There's also sides that match up. So we could say segment TJ is congruent to side RC. And then JD is congruent to CF. And then TD is congruent to RF. Okay? You can look at the picture and figure this out, or you can look at the name. If they're already named for you, either in the proof statement or otherwise, then you just look at how they match up. T is in the same place as R, J is in the same place as C, and D is in the same place as F. Okay? So technically, we don't need a picture for this. So I could just list the corresponding parts here. I could say angle W is congruent to angle M, and then angle Y is congruent to angle K, and angle S is congruent to angle V. Those are all corresponding parts. I can also do sides. I can say WY is congruent to MK, and YS is congruent to KV, and WS is congruent to MV. Okay, those are all the congruent corresponding parts of those triangles. All right. Let's say I give you a picture like this, and I say it's the fins of the space shuttle, and it suggests that they're congruent pentagons. All of the fins of the space shuttle would have to be the same thing, otherwise the space shuttle is not going to fly straight. Okay, so these pentagons have to be the same. I want the measure of angle B, right here. So it turns out, since these are all congruent, that means B has to be the same as E, right? I doubt the astronauts name those parts, but they look at it and they say that angle has to be the same as this angle or it's not going to work. So from our last chapter, we know that if we do the n minus 2 times 180 formula, pentagons add up to 540 degrees. So we can take 540 and subtract off all the other angles. So we'll take 540 minus 132, minus 90, minus 90, minus 88, and we have 140 left. That means the measure of angle B also has to be 140. That way our space shuttle will fly straight. Alright, we'll look at this and tell if the triangles are congruent. That means all of their sides have to be congruent, all of their angles have to be congruent. So let's start with the angles first. We know angle A is the same as angle E because they're marked the same. We know angle D over here is the same as B because they're both right angles, and all right angles are congruent. So then the third angle in here, these are vertical angles. So we know they're congruent also. So all three angles in the triangles are congruent already. Then for the sides, we have a 3 and a 3. We have a 4 and a 4. And then we've got these with the marks, which are also congruent. So that means all the sides are congruent as well. That means the triangles are congruent. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle, and you have to name it in the same order. So E matches up with A, D matches up with B, C matches up with C. To justify your answer, you would say all the sides and angles are congruent. All right, so our first theorem, it says if two angles of one triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle, then the third angles are congruent. So in our picture, angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle A is congruent to angle D. That means the angle C has to be the same as angle F just by default, because if we plug numbers into this, it would work, and it would just make those congruent. Okay, so this is automatic. Alright, so let's go try a proof. Speaking of proof, you guys know the first step every time. Just copy it down. Don't change a thing. You can list them in separate steps if you want, but if they have the same reason, then you don't have to list them as a separate step, unless we're going to use them differently. And I've got a type of proof that I'll show you in a little bit that is a little different. Alright, so first step is a given. Okay, also when you do your givens, I want you to go over to the picture and mark the givens on the picture. So, PQ is congruent to PS, QR is congruent to SR, and then angle Q is congruent to angle S. So that's what we have so far. And then QPR, angle QPR is right here. It's congruent to angle SPR. So we've got, so far we've got two sides and two angles in each triangle that are congruent. We need to find the third on both. Okay, so if we look at sides, you notice the third side of the triangle is shared between the two triangles. So that means PR has to be congruent to PR because it's shared. It's the same thing. That is the reflexive property. We're going to use the reflexive property a lot. Anytime the triangles share a side like that, that's going to be the reflexive property. Alright, so we've got three sides that are congruent. Now we just need three angles. We've got two of them. We need to know the third angle. So angle QRP is congruent to angle SRP. And that is because we've already got two angles congruent, so we know the third angles have to be congruent by theorem 4.1. Because that's what it says. It says if two angles are congruent, then the third is congruent. So, we've got three angles congruent, we've got three sides congruent, that means our triangles are congruent. So, triangle PQR is congruent to triangle PSR because all sides and angles are congruent. Okay, that's kind of how the proofs are going to work for now until we get a little farther into this chapter. Alright, let's try one more. So, first step, every time you notice I'm writing it down, that means you can't just set up your proof and be lazy and build your proof around what I've typed in. Copy it down. Okay, so given. And then we'll go through and we'll mark our picture. So angle A congruent to angle D. Angle E is congruent to angle C. AE is congruent to CD. EB is congruent to CB, and then BA is congruent to BD. So right now your triangles have all three sides that are congruent, and they have two angles that are congruent. So we just need one more angle. Okay, if we look in the middle, we have vertical angles right here in the middle. Okay, so angle ABE is congruent to angle, and you have to name it in the same order, DBC. And if you're not sure, look at the proof step and look at the triangles and how they're named, and name the angles. If you name ABE, then you have to name DBC. Okay, and that's by vertical angles theorem. Alright, so now our triangles have three sides congruent, three angles congruent. So we can say angle or triangle AEB is congruent to triangle DCB because all sides and angles are congruent. Okay? A lot of proofs are going to happen in this chapter. You can't get away from it. You're just going to have to do it. Alright, good luck.